Chapter 17. Pursuit of the Sea Furies. As Nancy stood temporarily stunned by her capture, a man peered from behind a curtain where baggage was usually stowed. He was tall and very thin. Nancy had never seen him before, but was sure he was an American. "How do you do, Miss Drew?" he said triumphantly. "Sorry I didn't meet you in New York, but I've been trailing you and your boyfriend around Hong Kong. This chance to take you in our plane is a lucky break. Are you prepared for a long ride?" Nancy recovered herself and eyed her captors unflinchingly. "You don't think you're going to get away with this, do you?" she retorted. The Chinese girl and her companion began to laugh scornfully. Then Chi-Che said, "She does not know how smart you are, Skinny Cord." Cord began to taunt Nancy about having her friend George Fane pose as Chi-Che Soong. "This Chi-Che makes a better substitute, doesn't she?" Nancy ignored the question. "Where is Chi-Che Soong?" she demanded. "In a place where you will never find her," Skinny Cord replied harshly. He now took a long rope from behind the curtain and with Chi-Che's help, bound Nancy's hands behind her back. He then forced her to lie down across 2 seats and tied her ankles together. "You may as well have a nap," Skinny Cord sneered. "You won't be doing any detecting." He and his girl companion walked up to the front of the plane, where the Chinese pilot was gunning the craft to top speed. "This is a dreadful fix to be in," Nancy groaned inwardly. "What am I going to do?" She thought of Ned back at the airport. Had he seen her enter the plane? Would he be able to effect a rescue? Maybe some other plane will pass us. Nancy's mind raced. If I could only signal it. The young sleuth suddenly remembered the lipstick she was carrying in her skirt pocket. By wriggling and squirming, Nancy was able to pull out the metal tube. By rubbing the case of the lipstick against the rope, she managed to detach the cap. Then she twisted the end until the red stick was showing. Slowly and painfully, Nancy managed to raise herself from the seats. "I mustn't let anyone see me," she thought. Keeping her eyes on the pilot's compartment, where her captors were busily talking, Nancy backed up to the window. With the lipstick, she wrote a large SOS backwards on the pane so that it would be legible from the outside. She then drew the small curtains across the window so that the writing would not be seen from inside. Weary from her efforts, the girl detective once more lay down across the 2 seats. Meanwhile, back at the airport, Ned Nickerson had arranged to charter the helicopter. He had come from the building and had been surprised to see Nancy go into the small 2-engine plane. Then, the next moment, it had suddenly taken off. "That's strange," the young man told himself. He dashed back to the airport building and rushed to the control tower to inquire about the plane. "We know nothing about it, except that it came in from Manila last Wednesday," the Chinese controller replied. "It made an unauthorized takeoff from the wrong runway before the airfield car could stop it. We tried to attract its attention by a red light from the tower, but the pilot paid no attention. No flight plan whatsoever was filed. They won't answer on the radio." "So you have no idea of the plane's intention or destination?" "None whatsoever." "A friend of mine is on that plane," Ned cried. "I'm afraid she's been kidnapped. We must do something at once." The official asked Ned several questions. When the youth had identified himself and told enough of the mystery to convince the man a rescue was urgent, the controller called the headquarters of the Fleet Air Arm of the British Royal Navy stationed in Hong Kong Harbor. After a lengthy and excited conversation, the official turned to Ned. "The chase has been started. There's an aircraft carrier a few miles out at sea engaged in practice exercises. It will try to pick up the plane by radar. As soon as it does, fighters will be sent out to force its return. A Navy helicopter is standing by, and is just about to leave for the carrier. Would you like to go with it?" "I sure would," Ned said. In a matter of seconds, he was on board. The pilot of the helicopter introduced himself as Lieutenant Commander Rawling, commanding officer of one of the Fury flights. "Glad to have you aboard," he told Ned. "My boys will be off after that plane shortly. It should still be well within radar range." Ned sat in the front seat beside the pilot. In a few minutes, they had crossed Victoria Island, and the great carrier came into view. 3 Sea Fury planes took off from its deck, one after the other. "We'll follow them as quickly as we can," Rawling said, "but this copter is much slower. I'll get the flight leader on the radio." He called and established contact. Ned could hear everything said by both men. In a few minutes, the flight leader reported,
"We have the aircraft in sight."
"Close in on him and make him turn back," Rawling commanded.
"Wilco, closing in on him rapidly now."
Ned heard the flight leader calling the aircraft on the radio, but there was no response. "They probably hear but won't answer," Ned guessed. "Remember, Nancy is on board," he said. "I hope your men won't shoot." "No," said Rawling. "They may try to make the pilot think they will, though." The lieutenant commander gave orders to the Furies, telling them in code the maneuvers to follow. The flight leader called back,
"There's an SOS on one of the cabin windows."
"Nancy must have put that there," Ned thought excitedly. In the kidnapper's plane, Nancy was both thrilled and frightened. She watched, fascinated, as one plane dived in front to slow them down, another swooped below, and the third above. One second she felt she was going to be rescued, the next that she might lose her life. Her captors seemed to be desperate enough to perish in the battle. The Chinese pilot, Skinny Cord, and Chi-Che were talking excitedly, both in Cantonese and in English. They had heard every word the commander of the pursuing 3-craft squadron had said. "Why should we take orders from them?" Cord cried out. "We can get away. They'd never risk shooting with Nancy Drew in our plane." "But we don't dare land in Taipei now, or we would be arrested," Chi-Che said. "And we may run out of gas and crash if we keep going." The Chinese pilot said, "If we do not go back, I am not at all sure they will not fire on us. I am not risking it. We are returning." Since his companions could not fly a plane, they were forced to accede to his decision. In a short time, to Nancy's relief, she felt the craft bank and turn. The pilot had lowered his landing gear as a token of surrender, she later learned. Nancy pushed her curtains open. Apparently, the fighter planes had changed position. Now one flew on each side of the kidnapper's craft, so close that Nancy could see each pilot's face clearly, at least that part of it which was not masked by his helmet and microphone. Ned was thrilled to hear a new voice calling Kai Tak and asking for landing instructions. "We've won!" he shouted. He strained his eyes on the distant horizon. Suddenly he pointed. "There they are!" 4 dots rapidly grew in size. Soon the kidnapper's plane came into view with a fighter on either side and one just below. "We'll follow them in," Rawling said. He radioed the airport for police to be on hand. As soon as the mystery plane had set down, the fighter leader landed, but instructed the others to return to the carrier. The helicopter was on the ground in seconds. The police were just handcuffing the arrested trio when Ned dashed into the aircraft. "Nancy!" He unfastened her bonds. "Oh, Ned, how can I ever thank you for rescuing me?" she cried. "I admit I've never been more scared in my life." "How do you feel now?" he asked solicitously. "I feel fine. Really, I do." "Thank goodness," Ned said. None of the prisoners would talk, so Nancy related as much of their story as she knew. Then the 3 captives were taken away. The young people said goodbye to Lieutenant Commander Rawling and thanked him profusely. Nancy and Ned then walked to the airport building, where Nancy washed her face and hands, combed her hair, and rested for a short time. Then she told Ned she was ready to go on to Cam Tin. The young man shook his head in astonishment. "You certainly can take it," he said admiringly. Ned found that the Chinese helicopter pilot, Jimmy Ching, was still available. Soon Nancy and Ned were airborne, heading for Cam Tin. It was not a long ride, and soon the helicopter was hovering over the walled city. It looked like a toy city surrounded by a moat. Beyond lay a vast expanse of fields, with a farmhouse here and there. The whirlybird came down on a field, and the occupants alighted. As the visitors began walking through the ancient city, the inhabitants stared at them expressionlessly. The three proceeded up one alley and down another. They could easily look into the houses, which were all open to the roadways and had bamboo curtains. These were now raised, but the pilot said they were lowered at night. Nancy and her fellow searchers saw nothing to indicate any smuggling activities, or that Chi Soong was being held prisoner in Cam Tin. Nancy observed, as they walked along, that the walled city was crowded and unsanitary. Nevertheless, she was intrigued by an artistic religious custom of the inhabitants. On walls, both inside and outside the homes, were brackets holding candles, flowers, and incense. The candles were lighted and the incense gave off a fragrant aroma. "I don't think the people of Cam Tin have anything to do with the mystery of the fire dragon," Ned whispered to Nancy presently. "The paper Mrs. Truesdale showed Mr. Long might refer to some farmhouse in the area instead of a place in town." Nancy nodded. The trio went through the city gate and set off down the main road toward the nearest farmhouse. As they approached it, the three could hear rhythmic hammering. The sound was not noisy. On the contrary, it was muffled and pleasant. "That hammering reminds me of gold beaters," Ned remarked. As Nancy and her companions drew closer to the farmhouse, they suddenly noticed a car coming in the opposite direction. It turned abruptly into a lane which led to the house. "Let's hide and see if we can find out what's going on here," Nancy suggested. They managed to conceal themselves behind a shed a few feet from the house. The driver of the car was talking to a Chinese farmer. Ned translated, "Is the shipment ready?" The farmer replied, "Yes." The driver then asked, "You kept enough to pay for the work?" The farmer replied angrily, "I cannot use this. I want Hong Kong dollars." The argument went on. The farmer threatened to expose the caller to the authorities if he were not paid at once. Finally, the driver pulled out a wad of bills and handed it to the farmer. The farmer pocketed the money, then called to someone inside the house. Several Chinese men, carrying 2 heavy chests, came outside and put them in the car. The caller drove off. "I'm sure we have a clue to the smuggling," Nancy whispered. "We'd better get back to the airport as fast as we can." Her companions agreed. As soon as they reached Kai Tak, the girl detective telephoned Mr. Lee Soong and told him of the Cam Tin trip, giving the car's license number and a description of the driver. "I will arrange to have the police find this driver and trail him," Mr. Soong said. "And the farmhouse at Cam Tin will be searched." Nancy thanked him. "I can hardly wait to find out what happens," she told Mr. Soong excitedly. End of chapter 17.